Okay, welcome everyone to the Atheist Society for the 11th of April 2024. We've had a few connection issues. We're trying a different setup in the hall here tonight, and we'll see how it goes. I want to mention something that I forgot to mention last time, but recently one of our regular attendees is no longer with us, and that is Rowan McLeod. He came to this society for years, regularly, sitting right over there, and he died of cancer, unfortunately, and some of us went to his funeral, which was very moving. I just want to note the passing of Rowan McLeod. Welcome to Michael Sherlock, who's going to enlighten us on the subject of wokeism. Over to you, Michael. Michael Sherlock. Michael
Thanks,
Sherlock. Would you like to introduce yourself, Michael?
Yeah, well, it seems like you've introduced my name quite well. Okay, so I guess, well, from this perspective, I'm an author. I've been a human rights activist and a secularist and atheist activist for over 10 years. I have a master's degree in religion, and I've made it my business to study not just religions per se, but cults and essentially the way human belief works on the brain as at an individual level and at a collective level. And wherever those beliefs have infringed upon human rights, I've always felt quite compelled to research and to read. And then once I've got my opinions grounded in the best evidence available, then to speak. And so the majority of my career has been focused on, in the beginning, Christianity, and because that was the religion closest to home. And so the first trilogy I wrote was against the Christian religion, essentially. But then after that, I've had 7 books published in total. 3 have been cancelled. Then I focused on Islam because I started getting involved in human rights work in the MENA countries, that is the Middle East, North African countries, where Islam has a stranglehold. And what I found was that Islam is fundamentally worse than Christianity. And I know a lot of people will take objection to that. And I don't mean that Christianity is a good religion in the sense that it's done no wrong. It's certain, I've documented all the harms it's done, not all the harms, but a large portion of the harms it's done. It's decimated societies. It's decimated human rights, women's rights, gay rights. It's had a horrible impact prior to the Enlightenment and even after. But the good thing about, I guess, Christianity is twofold. Number one, it's situated in cultures that experienced the Enlightenment, which was a very anti-Christian movement. A secularist uprising, and a scientific revolution. And so to understand the way Christianity operates today, you need to understand the larger cultural context in which it has its platform. And that platform is predominantly secularist and is growing largely to be very largely atheist now, non-believing. So if you look at the statistics in America and Australia, non-religious affiliated people are essentially the stats for those are going through the roof. As an atheist, there's nothing that makes me happier. I think that's fantastic. And again, not that there's not good teachings in Christianity and that there's not good teachings in the Quran, because there are good teachings in both of those books. But taken as a whole, the ideologies are divorced from reality. The ideologies are focused on spreading at the expense of human rights and women's rights and children's rights. And so even though most Christians are extremely well-meaning, even when they're doing conversion therapy or, forced rapes on lesbians to try and convert them to being straight again, or, you know, essentially poisoning gay people through conversion therapy practices to make them vomit when they see gay images, and do a kind of Pavlovian experiment on human beings to stop them being gay. These people are well-meaning when they're doing these things. And so that's fascinating to me. It's fascinating because the people who generally do the most harm are those who are captured by ideology and do not realize it, and whose intentions don't meet their intellectual foundations. So they have extremely good intentions without the knowledge or without the intellectual backing for those intentions. So it's like the old saying goes, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And this is what we see in religion. So getting back to, I guess, why I called Islam worse than Christianity, it was for, I guess, two reasons. Number one, the cultural context Christianity finds itself in, which is very secularist, whereas in Islam predominantly still, although you may look at Pakistan and say, well, that's a secularist country, it has a criminal code running next to the secularist criminal code, which is Sharia based, right? Because they're about 80% Sunni Muslim. So therefore, you have the rigid enforcement of brutal blasphemy laws that have the death penalty. There was years ago, I campaigned for a Christian woman who was put on death row, Asia Bibi, and we see the complete disregard for human rights in Islamic countries, and particularly for women's rights. And that's even in countries that are considered moderately Islamic, like Indonesia, for example, particularly in the province of like Aceh, where they have, you know, Islamic fundamentalists has clearly taken over. And you have public floggings and the like, and obviously Saudi Arabia, which is essentially a theocracy. Nigeria is another example. When I was the executive director of Atheist Alliance International, I was campaigning to save a 32-year-old Muslim's life because he was about to be hung for blasphemy. And his crime, what he did, he was on a WhatsApp message with a group of his congregants, and he was a gospel singer, an Islamic gospel singer. And he was praising his imam. But some of the audience thought that he was praising the imam so much that it took worship away from Muhammad. And so he was accused of essentially denigrating the Prophet Muhammad to venerate his own imam, and he was put on death row. So I attempted to liaise with Humanist International, who are a very large humanist group, and they do very good work. But unfortunately, the relationships between the big atheist and humanist organizations are all fraught with irrelevant politics. And I'll get to that in a second, because that's where wokeism first really reared its head for me. And I'll clarify what wokeism is as well. So I was campaigning for a 32-year-old Muslim to save his life in northern Nigeria. Now, ordinarily what we need to do to save someone, to step in on someone's behalf as an international charity, and Atheist Alliance was recognised at the UN Human Rights Council and the Council of Europe, we need consent, either from the party or from their relatives. Now, in this case, Yahya, his name was, the 32-year-old Muslim man, his family wanted him dead. So the question was, how do we get consent? We can't get it from him because he's missing in action. He's locked up and they're not letting him speak with us. We can't get it from his family because they want him dead. So where do we get that consent from? So the vice president at the time knew a group of lawyers in Nigeria, and we organised to get quasi-consent through that law firm. And that worked. That was a success. So we gained the necessary consent to run campaigns on his behalf and attempt to run legal appeals on his behalf to save his life. Of course, this upset Humanist International greatly, and I got some pretty angry emails from the then executive director of Humanist International telling me that I should leave the case alone. We don't have proper consent, because really he was angry at Atheist Alliance International, this CEO, this executive director. He just hated He hated me. He hated Atheist Alliance International, because for him, our politics should have been more woke. We should have been much more woke like he was, and like portions of Humanist International are. I won't say the whole organisation because, again, they do brilliant work. Anyway, we successfully lodged a legal appeal and we stayed the execution. I think we had days up our sleeve left before the hanging was due to occur. So he's still alive to my knowledge. He's still locked up. Very similar case to Mubarak Bala, who again was done for blasphemy. He was a humanist who was one of the officials in the Nigerian Humanist Association. And so we campaigned for him as well, but he's still locked up as well, unfortunately. And so getting back to the point that I was making, Islam exists within a culture where Islam is the dominant cultural force. And unlike Christianity, Islam is a religion that has a full briefcase of life instructions. So Islam has jurisprudence, that is, it has a legal foundation, how to run laws, how to operate laws. It has a legal system itself, which is Sharia law. It has dictates for every aspect of an individual and a society's life, whereas Christianity, particularly in its modern form after the Enlightenment, is more a personal thing. Even though you'll get people knocking on your door and you'll get lobbyist groups trying to, infringe upon human rights and things like that. I'm not saying they don't exist, they do. They just don't have the power that Islam has in its cultural context. So I first, came afoul of the woke, we call them, when I started criticizing Islam. So this is where I'm getting to my point now. So, but back then, Majid Nawaz, who was a liberal Muslim, coined the term regressive left. And the regressive left are essentially what you could call maybe the postmodernist left. That is, they've taken aspects of postmodernist theory, one of those main ones being cultural relativism, which at one level is a solid theory, because you can't judge a culture by another culture's standards, but at the same time, you can't take all the safeguards off and say, well, look, they chop people's head off in Saudi Arabia for insulting the prince. That's just their culture. Or the Taliban, behead women who try and get an education and they oppress women. That's just their culture. We need to respect that. That type of relativism or fundamentalist relativism I saw creep into the atheist movement, particularly through the humanist avenues, through the humanist organizations. But it also took over American atheists. It took over a large number of the atheist group, which is why I'm an advisor now on the board for Atheists for Liberty, which is an American an official charity, but I'm on their advisory board because they are specifically anti-woke. So one thing, I'm not sure if you've heard of Peter Boghossian. He's an atheist. He wrote a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. He was a professor at, I think it was Portland University in the US. And I had a number of long conversations with Peter. And he's one of the thought leaders in exposing wokeism, what we call wokeism now, or critical social justice. And he told me, he said, unless Atheist Alliance International is anti-woke, I guarantee you're going to be out of there in 6 months. And it's going to capitulate to wokeism. His prediction at the time was off by about 2 weeks. I ended up leaving because I just saw the landscape of the atheist movement. I actually saw quite a bit of corruption within the board of Atheist Alliance International. And I just thought there's no hope for the atheist movement as I see it, because the movement has suffered such mission drift from its core principles of promoting scientific reasoning, logic, evidence-based thinking, secularism, protecting atheists at risk. Very simple goals got sidetracked to, hang on a minute, why are we now more focused on BLM? Why are we now more focused on LGBTQ2SIAA plus rights and championing some of these things that we don't really understand? And it became a situation where the politics got so toxic within the atheist movement, it essentially crumbled in on itself. And this is where I first came across what we'd call the religion of wokeism. And I wrote a long piece on the religion of wokeism as well. Essentially, what wokeism is, it is an admix of the junk aspects of postmodernist theory by famous postmodernists like Michel Foucault and Didier and a few other postmodernist scholars, blended with neo-Marxism, a type of neo-Marxism. And I call it neo-Marxism because essentially what wokeism has done is pulled the labels of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie off, and they've kept the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, but they've strapped identity labels on it. So now it's not the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, it's straight versus gay, or it's gay versus trans, or it's white versus black. And they have a hierarchy, like a matrix, a hierarchy of oppression. And so the goal in wokeism is to race to the bottom. Who's at the very bottom? Who is the most victimized victim you can be? And it's made being a victim essentially the goal. That is the goal. And you'll see this if you watch TikTok and if you watch these, these what you call woke people. It's always about victim signaling and also virtue signaling. So these are the two things that wokeism excels at, because essentially wokeism survives and evangelizes by using linguistic tricks. And religion's done this for thousands of years as well. If you look at it, a linguistic trick in Christianity, for example, salvation. I mean, who doesn't want salvation? That sounds like a nice thing to me. I want to be saved, I want salvation. But when you say, well, that comes into a Mott and Bailey fallacy. And a Mott and Bailey fallacy is you have a Mott that's easy to defend. You have the Bailey, that's the difficult part to defend. So when you look at salvation, the Mott part of it is, don't you want to be saved? Don't you want to have a nice life and be happy and have all these great things and all the wonderful things? That's easy to defend that. But okay, let's look at the Bailey in salvation. Well, you have to give up rational thought. You have to give into the doctrines of Christianity and abide by those doctrines. You have to discriminate against those the religion discriminates against. That's taken out of your hands, and now you're just a mechanism in this larger machine. And so that's the Bailey. And wokeism does the same thing. If you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, 3 words that sound amazing, and I think most rational, sane people want those things. I want diversity. I love diversity. I think it's amazing. I would hate to drive down the road and there's only fish and chip shops. Or, I'd hate there to be only one culture. So I love the fact that we live in a multicultural society where we get to experience all these different cultures. That's diversity, right? But that's not diversity in wokeism. That's the Mott. That's the easy part to defend. Aren't you accepting of others? Isn't that? Of course. But the Bailey, the part that's hard to defend in diversity is, it's not really about diversity with wokeism, it's about ideological hegemony. And you'll notice this whenever, for example, African Americans in America step outside of the ideology of wokeism. That is, maybe they express an opinion that's contrary to an opinion expressed by Black Lives Matter organization. Maybe they express a different opinion. Now, all of a sudden, they're no longer considered part of that diverse victim group. They're now placed with the oppressor. So, for example, Coleman Hughes is an outspoken advocate against anti-racism. And again, this is another linguistic trick. Anti-racism, which is the brainchild of Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, who are 2 absolute crackpots. Anti-racism, and this is Ibram's own words, anti-racism dictates that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. In other words, what we need to do, we need to be racist against the people who are racist against us in order to solve racism. That's like saying the only way to cure AIDS is with AIDS. It's a nonsensical non-starter, and it tries to teach white people that we are inherently born into sin. And this is where it's very religious as well. So whiteness is the original sin. The cure for original sin is to become born again, is to become awakened, awoke. All right. So that's essentially one religious aspect of wokeism, where anti-racism says all white people are evil and all black people are victims. This is not only unfair to most white people, it's completely unfair to most black people. And it also, by trying to embed and internalize the victimhood mentality into people, you essentially cut their knees out from under them. And so Coleman Hughes is someone I'd recommend, highly recommend you have a listen to. He's very balanced, very intelligent, very mild. So I think he's a very good resource in that area. And Glenn Lowry is another one as well in the race area. So if you look at wokeism, it came out of the critical social justice academia. I call it academia, but it's really nonsense. So wokeism came out of, for example, critical race theory, fat theory and fat studies, gender studies, queer theory by Judith Butler. These are all the corpus of holy texts for wokeism. And these bled out of academia into society, where essentially previously universities were about ideas, like sharing ideas, an open marketplace of ideas. Eventually, most universities now, particularly in the Western America, England, Australia as well, is seeing this. They're being captured by this portion of the left. And this portion of the left is reactionary. And it says it's not good enough to theorize, you have to go out and be an activist. Now, fair enough, I'm not saying activism is bad. I've been an activist for over a decade. But if you're not grounding your activism in good thinking, and this goes back to good intentions without good thinking, then your activism just essentially becomes destruction and divisive, and it becomes chaotic. And that's what we're seeing across the board with wokeism. You see it in their race sects. So the way I think about it is wokeism is the overarching religious structure, and then you have sects like you do in Christianity, denominations, if you like. You have their race sect, you have the LGBTQIA, I don't want to miss one, LGBTQIAA2S plus movement. You have, which is absurd in itself, right? It used to be LGBT. Or first it used to be LGB, and then just kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And the reason, and now that it's grown so much, it's caused problems within this, and it's not even a community, within this collection of identity groups. It's causing havoc. And now we're starting to see LGB and trans rights activists clashing. You're seeing trans rights activists clashing with women's rights groups. It's creating absolute chaos. And that is because the religion of wokeism, being based on postmodernism and Marxism, is both detached from reality and it is reactionary. So its idea, so getting back to diversity, that's great. We all want diversity, but really what we know is in wokeism, that means ideological hegemony with superficial phenotypical diversity. Okay, we need this many brown people, we need this many black people, we need this many LGBTQI plus whatever people. And that feeds into its idea of equity, which again is, sounds great. All right, it sounds great. Equity sounds great. But equity is, in fact, a form of discrimination. And it is a form of giving power over to a higher authority to dictate quotas and fix people into identity groups. And that's another aspect of wokeism, is it's fierce, one-eyed focus on identity politics. I don't want to dismiss identity politics completely, because identity politics can be useful and has been useful in the past. When people rally around an oppressed group that is being overtly oppressed by society, they have strength in numbers. All right, it's the union theory, right? So in that sense, identity politics can be useful. But the idea of identity politics is it has a function, and that is to balance power. And then the identity politics needs to dissipate, and everyone is considered human beings again. All just human beings. That's my philosophy as well, right? I identify as a human being. But identity politics in wokeism isn't that. It is saying you need to stay in this identity group. This identity group is more important than your individual personality. The content of your character is less important than the color of your skin, which is in direct contradiction of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, which I'm a strong advocate for. And I think we need to get back to that type of social justice movement, particularly now for We're seeing a backlash against the LGBT, the rest of the acronyms, movement. We're starting to see a backlash now. And it's understandable why we're seeing a backlash. It's understandable. I don't justify the backlash. But what we have is an ideology that's detached from reality and is reactionary. So if you look at the trans rights movement, and this is something I've been reading quite a lot about, they've been happy to sterilize children for the ideology. It's basically FGM, right? Female genital mutilation and male genital mutilation in service to ideology. They've been happy to invade women's spaces and take away women's sex-based rights that they've fought for hundreds of years for and died for. If you look at the suffragettes movement, they're happy to give children pornography, essentially pornography, give children pornography in order to show everyone how progressive and, you know, look, we're here, we're queer. And for me, the queer, the Q is the problem in that whole big long acronym. It's not the T, it's not the rest of it, it's the Q. Because the Q being queer, which was a derogatory term for gay or gender non-conforming, if you like, which was a derogatory term, now represents Judith Butler's queer theory. And Judith Butler's queer theory is based on postmodernism and Marxism. So essentially, one of the main doctrines of that religion is because you can't ever know the truth, this is according to this ideology, you can never know the truth. There's no such thing as empirical evidence. There's no such thing as objective reality. Everything you think you know is part of what postmodernism calls dominant discourses. So it's discourses created by the powerful, given to us meekies, us plebs. We share that with each other, and that then becomes a dominant discourse. It's known as a dominant discourse, but it's not reality according to the postmodernists, right? Who are a massive influence on wokeism. So according to the postmodernism, the best way to find knowledge is through the individual lived experience. And you've probably heard that term escalate recently in time as well, because that's bled out from these types of areas as well. And I should mention, within my sociology degree, I did study gender politics, gender studies and race politics. I've done the woke subjects. And there was nothing quite so interesting as walking out of a law lecture where the evidentiary threshold is so high, and walking into one of these lectures where, well, like 58 people felt this and they so happen to have this same identity, and therefore we conclude this is the fact. And I used to think that's really weak ad hoc evidence. And even the studies were weak. And one of the, Peter Boghossian, who I spoke about earlier, he and two other scholars, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, managed to publish a whole bunch of hoax papers to top-tier feminist and gender studies journals. And they got them through the peer review process as well. One of them, Peter Boghossian, simply translated Hitler's Mein Kampf and replaced Jew with white man. Wherever Hitler said Jew, he put white man, and he turned it into a kind of feminist theory, and they accepted it. So they essentially accepted Hitler's Mein Kampf. They did another one where dogs humping in the park was proof of patriarchal rape culture. And that passed through the peer review process as well, got accepted. And the only criticism there apparently was they didn't respect the dog's privacy enough. So this is the body of scholarship that is informing current gender clinics, gender surgery, the way we treat children who are suffering from gender dysphoria. This is the base academic foundation for all of this. Not only that, but for how we're starting to determine policies. And one thing here is when you look at a current case that's going on in Australia right now, Tickle v. Giggle, which is essentially a women's rights case. A lot of it's being framed as anti-trans, and the trans lobby loves to do this. Anything that goes against their immediate wants, it's anti-trans. So not wanting to sterilize children is anti-trans. Men just simply declaring that they're a woman and being allowed into a female prison, even when they're convicted of rape, and this has happened many times, that's anti-trans to complain about that situation and to say, hey, we need to have a discussion about this. Or, for example, when you have male MMA fighters, cage fighters, like Fallon Fox, breaking the skulls of female opponents because he identifies as a female now because he couldn't make it all the way in the male division. So he all of a sudden identifies as a female, goes across, does some of the procedures, and now he's actually cracking skulls in the female division because, well, male bone density is thicker. Our muscle mass is stronger. Our testosterone is higher. We're at a chromosomal level, we are not females, and females are not males. But this wokeism, because nothing is real, everything is lived experience, as soon as someone says, I identify as, that makes it real, or on par with what the dominant discourse is. Now, the dominant discourse in that area is biological reality, which is the basis of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So evolutionary biologist Colin Wright, and I serve on the same advisory board with him on this anti-woke atheist organisation. He's been called in as an expert witness to this current case in Australia, the Tickle v Giggle case, because he's seen, and to his bewilderment as an evolutionary biologist, you've even got publications like the Scientific American, who were a very trusted publication, now trying to argue that sex is a spectrum, or that because clownfish can change sex, therefore human beings can change sex, even though they're not mammals. So we're having this very bizarre situation where, you know, most of us know there are two sexes. Yes, there's intersex, all right? Intersex is a condition. It's an evolutionary aberration, but it is a mixture of the two sexes. It's not a separate third sex. So there's not three gametes. There's not a male gamete, female gamete, and an intersex gamete, all right? So there's only two types of gametes, and that's because there's two sexes. But this fact is being considered anti-trans. So speaking the truth now is anti-trans. Now, this is how wokeism is very similar to Hamas, okay? And I know it sounds dramatic. But essentially, because wokeism latches onto quote-unquote marginalised movements to promote the ideology, it uses marginalised people as human shields. So if I criticise, I say, well, look, you know, the evidence on puberty blockers is pretty bad. It looks like in the long term they cause, you know, osteoporosis, sterility, loss of sexual function, and, you know, these problems. All of a sudden they're like, oh, so you're trying to genocide trans people. It's like, no, you're holding a trans person up as a human shield right now, so I can't criticise an ideological statement you're making, which is not grounded in science. It's not based in fact. In fact, it's based in very poor pseudoscience, which now, based on the Cass report that's just been released, and if anyone wants to look it up, the WPATH files, so the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is an absolute sham. And major medical organisations and hospitals have been using their guidelines to treat gender-confused children. And now we've just found out that the WPATH don't even know how they're getting informed consent. They're like, well, we can't get it all the time. There's so many files that were leaked from the WPATH, I guess, internal communications, that we now know that this whole gender affirmative model is based on activism and ideology, not science and medicine. Now, to divorce good intentions from good thinking is to contradict the do no harm principle in medicine. But trans activists and the woke have been more than happy to flout those core principles: informed consent, do no harm, as long as it conforms with the ideology. That is one of the ideological statements in the woke trans sect or cult, is that you can be born in the wrong body. So a man can be born in a woman's body, a woman can be born in a man's body. That's simply bullshit. I'm sorry, that is pseudoscience. That is like saying the gender is a soul. So they're arguing basically that gender is a sex that's soul. So I don't have enough faith as an atheist to swallow that type of rubbish. So that the soul can somehow float down and fall into the wrong physical body. Now, I'm not saying that gender dysphoria doesn't exist, and it has existed in an extremely small percentage of predominantly men up until recently. And now the main demographic that's getting hit with gender dysphoria, and all of a sudden, too, not like they're not experiencing it pre-puberty, all that, is teenage and adolescent girls. This has become a massive social contagion. We've seen about a 4,000% increase in people showing up to gender clinics confused about their gender. One of the other problems with the ideology is with the trans cult, it ignores all the comorbidities that come along with people presenting with gender dysphoria. So what we now know from studies and from journalists like Hannah Barnes, I think her name is, she did a massive review of the NHS and Tavistock, who were doing who ran the GIDS clinic there, the Gender Identity Disorder Clinic, is that at least 35% of the people treated for gender dysphoria were also autistic. And other high numbers of children presenting with gender dysphoria had other conditions like schizophrenia and other, issues that were just simply being ignored, pushed aside, and said, okay, well, the cure for you is to go on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones and then get your surgery and your whole life will be wonderful. That's obviously a lie. That's taking one data point for ideological reasons, and we know ideologies love to data mine. So they've data mined that one point and said, okay, this is your one cure for everything. It's our religion. Our religion is your cure. Accept Jesus, accept the puberty blocker, and you even see that transubstantiation. The Catholics have that transubstantiation where something that's one form can turn into another form simply by an incantation, right? Well, I am a woman. I identify as a woman. Now, all of a sudden, hey presto, I'm an actual woman. It's transubstantiation. It is a religious belief. And getting back to the WPATH files, which is the files released by the Environmental Progress Organisation, Mia Hughes and Michael Schellenberger, bear with me a sec. What they found is there was one case the WPATH were looking at where someone presented with multiple personality disorder at a gender clinic, and the question was, and the person had 12 different personalities, like 12 different alters, right? And so they were like, we have to bring out each personality and get their consent to do the gender surgery. Like, if you don't see the insanity in that, if that doesn't make you put the brakes on and go, hang on a minute, we need to take another look at this issue, then more than likely you are driven by ideology. And belief persistence is the issue. And that's always been my fascination, is that belief persistence. So when we look at wokeism and you look at the impact it's had on universities, when you look at the stifling impact it's had in Scotland, particularly now with its new hate speech laws, and again, who wouldn't want to get rid of hate speech? Hate is a horrible thing. But when you look at the real, what is hate speech, the laws themselves, misgendering someone, it's one thing for someone to consider themselves one sex or another, and everyone should have the freedom to identify any way they want. But if another person doesn't believe that, if another person says, well, actually, no, that contradicts my beliefs, I believe this. Now, if that person can't say, well, I believe this, without going to prison, you're basically dealing with a blasphemy law, a secular blasphemy law. And that's the way hate speech laws work. And because hate is such a vague concept and you can't even define, I hate rape. Should I be in trouble for saying I hate rape? So what is justified hate? Well, that depends on the social mores, and there we get into murky waters again. And it's the hate speech laws in the West have always been used as justifications by more fundamentalist Islamic countries as well to push their version of religious hate speech laws. And so we're seeing wokeism essentially erode the separation of church and state by posing as secularism, by posing as a non-ideology, and by using a Mott and Bailey fallacy, that is linguistic tricks. Inclusion. Of course inclusion's good. I want everyone to feel welcome, but if that means I'm not allowed to say my opinion because someone will feel unsafe hearing a different opinion, well, that's not inclusion, that's censorship. And how dare you decide what other people should be able to hear and what they shouldn't be able to hear? But that's inclusion in wokeism. That's what inclusion really means. So once you unpack the linguistic tricks there, and I've done that with the religion in the past, and I'm doing it with this religion now, I'd call wokeism a new age apocalyptic political cult. And that's pretty much what it is. It's searching for a utopia that doesn't exist, and the ends justify the means. And in the past, if an identity group has been mean to another identity group, it's okay for you now to be mean to someone in that identity group because they're the oppressor. And as Ibram X. Kendi said, the only way to resolve past discrimination is present discrimination. And that's the ideological thinking here.